Morning year 9, maybe afternoon, or even perhaps evening, depending on how out of sync of routine you are. It's Liz Singer, and I'm going to be going through your second PowerPoint on practicing exam questions. So last week I went over part 1, 2 and 3, which I think a lot of you said you found quite helpful listening to me talking over it rather than reading it from the PowerPoint. And I also think hopefully it really helped jog your memory of stuff that we had done already previously in lessons when we had been doing exam practice before lockdown. Today then I'm going to be going over a part 4 and 5, so it's the final two questions of a 24-mark paper. So our aim, very much like last week, is to revise the structure of a GCSE paper as a whole, and more specifically revising the structure of what you should be using in a part 4 and 5 answer. On last week's slideshow, I added this knowledge organizer, which really summarises all that you need to know about Christian practices, and it is put over 2 sides because there's quite a lot packed into Christian practices, but also there's a lot of new keywords which you wouldn't have come across in the Christian beliefs section that we did in the second term of this year. So down the left hand side again you've got those keywords, but also what's really fab is on the right hand side at the bottom you've got the teachings, so direct quotes from the Bible and perhaps Jesus himself, disciples, things that you can apply to your answers to get you those top marks. And then, like I said, it goes on to a second page, and this second page covers what you would have been doing in the past couple of weeks, so the final kind of 3 to 4 lines of the PLC sheet. So now you've done all of that, we can apply our knowledge to the trickier half of the paper, the 5 marker and the 12 marker. So the part 4 then, which is a 5 marker, very, very similar structure to the part 3 which we did last week. In fact, exactly the same, bar one thing, which hopefully you've worked out, and that is that you need to include a quote to gain that 5th mark. Without including some sort of evidence from Jesus or the Bible, you won't be able to gain that 5th mark. So you can see the difference where it starts to increase and kind of ramp up. You start with your kind of basics and your basic knowledge in the part 1, 2 and 3, and then it's asking you now to really show how in-depth your knowledge is by providing evidence to back up your point. So our structure, very similar to part 3, is going to be point. This is where it's slightly different. You're going to add the evidence, then you're going to explain it, and then you add your second point, and then you're going to explain it. So this PEVEPE structure is what we are going to be using today, and it is what we have previously used in our revision lessons, in our exam prep lessons, so it shouldn't be anything new. Hopefully it's just revision for you. Okay, so our example question for a part 4 today then is going to be explain 2 ways in which Christian street pastors carry out their Christian duty. The reason I've chosen this one is because last year when we did it with this current year, with the year 10s, it really tripped them up, because we had focused so much on prayer, I think, and Eucharist, that they had kind of forgotten these smaller questions or parts of Christian practices that you can get a question on. So we're going to do this as a way of also revising street pastors and making sure you've not misunderstood what their role is on the streets. So our question, the first thing you do then when you see a part 4 is you're going to be looking at the explain. So it's telling us then that we need to give a point and we need to really explain what it means. And what is the thing that we are going to be explaining? Well, it's ways they carry out. So we're going to be explaining actions that they do as Christian street pastors. So it's not asking what they believe or what they study. It's asking out how they carry out their Christian duty. So what specific physical actions do they do as a result of being a Christian street pastor? But what's also really important with a part 4 question is this, what we call a rider sentence, because it rides along with the question. It comes as a whole, and that is refer to sacred writings and another source. Again, so that could be Jesus in your answer. Without this, they've made it very clear that this is what they want, and this rider sentence will be the same every single time. You've got to include that evidence. So let's see how we would do this. So explain 2 ways in which Christian street pastors carry out their Christian duty. As always, I'm going to start with the sentence starter, one way. So one way in which street pastors can carry out their Christian duty is to focus on young people in need. For example, patrolling the streets or towns and cities at night and caring for them in practical ways. This follows the teaching of love thy neighbour, which teaches Christians to look out for all people and care for them. So in this first section then, I've given my point. I'm going to try and attempt to highlight on the computer. I've given my point, which is to focus on young people in need. For example, and this is the action, this is what they carry out, patrolling the streets or towns or cities at night and caring for them in practical ways. Why do they do this then? Because remember, we're explaining. They do this because it follows the teaching of love thy neighbour. And then I've put after in brackets Bible to be really specific about where I've got my evidence from. And that is there, your 5th mark. But I can't just leave it on a quote. It needs me to explain my quote. So then I go into the second half of my explanation, which teaches Christians to look out for all people and to care for them. So I've got my point, my evidence, and then my explanation. And we would do this in lesson where we would write a P. Ooh, I'll try again. We write a P. I've got my point here in yellow. I've got my evidence here in green. And then I've got my explanation here in blue. And again, looking at it from an examiner's point of view, the structure is extremely clear. And again, they can't argue with a structure that is so clear. And then moving on to my second point, again using the sentence starter, another way in which they carry out their duty is to allow people to talk to them in confidence. Here's my first point. They allow people, so technical skills are not great. They allow people to talk to them in confidence. That's a physical action they do. So that's my point. And then my evidence, my explanation, this could be about worries or anxieties that person is feeling. So again then, if I was to label it with my red pen, I've got my point in yellow here, and then I've got my explanation in blue here, following that PEVE structure we spoke about on 2 slides ago. So again, looking at it from an examiner's point of view then, I'm going to be thinking to myself, there's my first tick for my point, my second tick for my evidence, third tick for the explanation of that evidence. Then they've got their fourth tick for their second point and their fifth tick for the explanation of that second point. And hopefully as well, what you're seeing here is how short and sweet you can keep it. A lot of us are guilty of overwriting, and that's often a result of panicking. You think you need to write more than you do. And actually, it's very nice and simple and easy. Your point, your evidence, your explanation, your point, your explanation. So that would be a good example of a 5 marker. And in fact, you can see where I haven't highlighted, meaning that I could probably cut it down even more, but we do want to make sure we're writing using good English. So sometimes you may find you can't highlight the whole paragraph. And so finally then, the reason I said that I wanted to pick this one is because this year our year 10s got slightly confused by this and thought that Christian street pastors meant that they have to go out and preach and convert people to Christianity, and that is not their duty as a Christian street pastor. So please make sure you're not thinking that they want to go out in the evenings and preach and convert people. Their whole duty, their whole reason they do it is simply to look out for people who are often quite vulnerable on nights out, who are perhaps homeless on the streets, and so that's their role, and their duty is to look after people, not to preach and to convert. So make sure you've got that down. Okay, moving on. So last week what I did was just pop it down on a sheet just for you to see, and I've done the same again here. Most of you will know by now this is how you lay it out on a piece of paper, but I just thought I'd put it there as a visual representation for you to mirror what I did last week. Okay, and on to the part 5, which is the 12 marker. So before I go through an example 12 marker, I just want to remind you of a few basic things when it comes to a part 5. Now, part 5 is actually worth 50% of your marks of a 24 mark paper, and so you really need to be allowing yourself at least 15 minutes to complete it. And this is why I repeated myself so much in the previous PowerPoint and also in lesson about how you really want to be getting on with your answers nice and quickly and keeping them simple and succinct, because you want to be banking as many minutes as possible for this 12 mark question. So this is what the layout of it looks like. As we know, there's a 1 marker, 2 marker, 4 marker, 5 marker and a 12 marker. And all in all, this adds up to 24 marks. And you would do in an exam, you would do this 4 times over. So if we're having to do this 4 times over, and in 1 hour and 45, you're having to write 4 12 markers, you need to really be getting into the habit of banking the 1 marker, 2 marker, 4 marker, 5 marker nice and quickly within kind of the first 10 to 15 minutes of the exam, and then making sure you've left those 15 minutes to complete the 12 marker. But this also means, as you can see then, that the 12 marker is the biggest one, and I do think this is why we get into a bit of a panic about it and we make it out bigger in our head than it needs to be. Yes, I've said obviously that it is 50% of your marks, but actually it's not as big and scary once you break it down and you're clear on your structure. And the structure you use for a 12 marker is the same every time, regardless of the topic of the question. So practicing that structure now is going to be really, really key to our success. So structure of a 12 marker. You should ideally have it in 4 paragraphs, and this is what we try to encourage. So the beginning one is your intro. Often this is just a sentence and is the easiest part, and that's when you're explaining what the statement means, or you're kind of telling the examiner you know what it's implying. You may wish to define the key terms in the statement as well, just to, again, show the examiner you know what it's asking you and you understand the purpose of the question and what it's about. Then you go into your second paragraph, which is to offer arguments in support of the statement. So these arguments should be justified with examples, key terms, quotes. So you're almost using the structure of a part 5, that point, evidence, explain, and you're popping it into the offer arguments in support of the statement. Then, as you've probably worked out, you need the other arguments. So are there any other arguments that could be put forward that actually disagree with your first points or agree perhaps? And again, you must provide, and this is the really key statement here, you must provide justified views, and justified means that you've used quotes or examples. You've been able to back up your point. And then finally, you come to a reasoned conclusion. Your conclusion should never offer any new points, and this is something which I've drilled into you in lessons. You shouldn't be coming up with new points. You should be summarising the main points of the arguments from paragraph 2 and 3, so here and here. Don't then start offering new points, because the examiner thinks that you're coming to an end and that you're going to give a reasoned conclusion, and all of a sudden you're bringing in new points, and that will confuse the examiner, and we want to make it very nice and clear that we know what we're doing. And you can include your view in either paragraph 2 or 3, depending on whether it's appropriate or not, but I tend to say leave it out of the conclusion, and I'll come back to the reason as to why we're going to do that when we're actually writing the conclusion up. So this is what a paper would look like when you get to the 12 marker, and this layout is the same every single time. So this bit here, it will always have this. The only thing that will change is obviously the statement at the top. Our statement for today is the best way for Christians to reach an understanding of God is by practicing prayer. Our statement then is to evaluate it. Now, when you look at what evaluate means on the AQA website, it means to judge from available evidence. So we're going to use evidence for both sides of the argument to evaluate this statement. Is it the best way for people to understand God, or is it not? My circle and arrow, the wrong way around there. So what are we judging then? We're judging whether prayer or perhaps the Eucharist or celebrating festivals could be the best way of understanding God. That's what I've just said. So here it's helping to give you a structure. If you get into the exam and you panic and you think, oh, what did Miss Singer say about how to structure a 12 marker? Really, here you've got the structure, and it tells you how to answer this question. It's saying by giving arguments for both sides and then coming to a conclusion on which argument we think is the strongest. Okay, so it's time to actually sit down and complete the question. The first thing I would do would be to plan just whilst we're at home. Obviously you wouldn't have time to do this in the exam, but it's a really good way of starting to build your confidence when it comes to actually answering a 12 marker. So I pop the statement in the middle of the page, and remember we're focusing on the idea that practicing prayer is the best way to reach an understanding of God. So to do that, I'm going to have arguments in support on the left-hand side, and I'm going to have arguments in support of a different point of view on the right-hand side. Note that I'm not using the language for and against, because we're not trying to go for and against. We're just trying to provide the examiner with an understanding that actually prayer could be the best way, but there could also be other ways. And we're really evaluating this statement rather than just pitching people against each other. So my first point in arguments of support could be that actually prayer is direct contact between you and God. So surely through direct contact that is personal to you, it's not based on other people's opinions or views or experiences, which could be wrong, that prayer is the best way of understanding God. Secondly, the believer focuses on that feeling of being in God's presence, and this is often described as a feeling of awe and wonder. And through prayer, where you get this feeling of awe and wonder because of God's presence, you're able to see his greatness, and he's really showing you his power. That's very important, and that really shows us what God is like. So therefore, prayer is the best way to understand God. And finally, God is beyond description, but because words get their meanings from human and the natural world around us, and he can't surely just be understood by reading about him or hearing other people talk about him. We have to experience him, and prayer is one of the ways in which we experience him, and we get a real understanding of what he's like when he's in our presence, and not just from what we're reading in a Bible or what we can see in nature, and therefore surely prayer is the best way of understanding God. Moving over to the other side then, which is arguments in support of a different view. Not everyone can have this kind of prayer experience, so not everyone might get along with prayer and actually enjoy the experience of prayer, and you don't have to pray to be a Christian. So therefore some would argue actually they find other ways of understanding God, and prayer is not the best way of understanding him. Secondly, the Bible is what we refer to as the inspired word of God, and in some cases the direct word of God. He chose for those things to be written down to show a real presentation of himself, and what he wanted people to know about him is in the Bible. Therefore, surely reading the Bible is the best way of understanding him, and prayer is not the best way. And finally, some Christians believe that actually the best way to understand God is through studying nature, because nature and the earth and universe is God's creation, and it's a real expression of himself, and therefore they believe that actually through nature we could really understand what God is like and his characteristics, and not through prayer. So we've come up with arguments in support and arguments in support of a different point of view. Now we're going to start to piece it together into paragraphs. Remember, my first thing I'm going to do is my intro, and like I said previously, this can just be a sentence, and that's all I've done. So I've put for my intro, this statement implies that the best way to understand God is through prayer. Nice and simple and easy. That would take you, what, 10-15 seconds to get, and that's your intro done. That's your first paragraph, if you want to call it a paragraph. Right, now I'm going to be moving on to my first point, and I've decided that I want to go for this first argument that I came up with, which is the fact that prayer is direct contact between you and God, and therefore could be a reason why prayer is the best way. So I'm going to start with the sentence starter I've always encouraged you to use if you're stuck on how to start off a sentence, and that's on the one hand. So on the one hand, it could be argued that prayer is the best way of understanding God because it's direct contact between the believer and God. This means, and this is my explanation, so I've given you the point, this means a Christian has a very personal understanding of their God, and it's not influenced by other people's beliefs. Therefore, you could argue that prayer is the best way of understanding God, and I'm going to put this in a separate colour. Let's pick one. Therefore, you could, oh, that's no use, it's completely just gone over it. Let's try this one. Therefore, there we go. You could argue that prayer is the best way of understanding God, as it's not tainted by others' views and opinions. It's a true experience of your understanding of God. So as an examiner, I'm thinking this is really good because they've got their point, then they've got their explanation, and then they've linked it to the original statement. So remember, the language in the statement is that the best way for Christians to reach an understanding of God is through practicing prayer. And what they've got in their answer here is that you could argue that prayer is the best way of understanding God, and then why? What I would try to do next then, if you're able to, is actually come up with some evidence. So for me, I thought that this is evidence that I could fit into this answer. Some Christians believe that prayer is a conversation between them and God. The Bible teaches, so here's my evidence. We'll go for orange. My mouse has disappeared. here we go. So the Bible teaches, come and pray to me and I will listen to you. Therefore, prayer can be argued to be the best way to understand him, as he is telling you here in this quote that he will communicate with you. So you are communicating with him directly. And this direct communication surely means that the best way to understand him is through prayer. And here then, switching to my red pen, I've got a point at the beginning, and then I've got my evidence, and then I've got my explanation. And you can see how I'm mirroring the same structures all the way through my 4, 5 and 12 marker. And as long as we practice that structure, we can apply it to nearly every question. So that's my first point. So on to my second point, where I'm going to be giving arguments in support of a different viewpoint. So I decided out of the 3 that we had, I'm going to go for the second one, as I think it's a really strong argument in opposition to our first point. So again, I'm going to be using my sentence starter of on the other hand. So on the other hand, it could be argued actually there are better ways of understanding God, for example, through the Bible, which holds the true word of God, his teachings and creations. So here I've actually given an example, and that's that through the Bible we understand the true word of God, his teachings and his creations. Therefore, it could be argued that reading the Bible is the best way a Christian can understand God. Because I've been able to think of another point, I've added it. So I've gone for, in the Bible it teaches, so this is a second piece of evidence, all things are possible with God. Quotes like this show what God is really like. And this is my explanation. So quotes like this show what God is really like and what he is capable, and of what he is capable. Therefore, it is the best way for Christians to reach an understanding of God. And again, in my red pen, I've got my point at the beginning, then I've got my evidence, then I've got my explanation, then I've given more evidence, and then I've given an explanation. I never give a piece of evidence without explaining it. And from an examiner's point of view, this would be a really, really good paragraph. And again, you can see how short it is. No overwriting, sticking to the point, giving my evidence, explaining it, moving on, and not lingering or waffling on anything. So then I come on to my conclusion. My conclusion is really a summing up, like I said, of what points you have already given. It's not giving any new points, and furthermore, it's not giving us your opinion. And that's because the examiner's not looking for your opinion. They're looking to see whether you've really understood that actually, yes, you've got one side of the argument, you've got the other, but which one is coming across as the strongest? And therefore we just play around with the words. We take out the word I and instead we put it. So I always start a conclusion with in conclusion. It, so instead of I believe, we're going to put it could be argued that the arguments in support of the statement are the strongest. So this is a conclusion we're coming to. You could have said the other way, but I think that arguments for the first half were really good. Why then? What's the evidence to say that actually the arguments in support were the strongest? This is due to the fact that you can have a one-on-one conversation with God, really understand him and learn about him. Furthermore, the word of the Bible could be mistranslated and therefore not reliable when it comes to understanding God. My explanation, as a result, prayer is the best way to reach an understanding of God. And here in this last line you can see I'm not doing something we refer to as sitting on the fence. I'm not saying it could be this one, it could be that one. I've come to a clear conclusion. As a result, prayer is the best way to reach an understanding of God. Okay. So once you've written it all out, it will look something like this. Once again, you've got your number 5 in the margin, and then you've written it out on your lined paper. Again, obviously, I'm not very good at lining up the lines with the words, but you get the gist of it. What next then? So we've gone over a 4 marker and a 5 marker. Previously we went over a 1 marker, 2 marker and a 3 marker. So unfortunately it is time for you to have a go. But I have full confidence in all of you that you are going to be able to do this, because you showed us evidence of that before lockdown in our previous assessments. We're going to give you some practice exam questions then, and you're going to have a go and use what you've learned over the past couple of weeks and the exam practice help on this PowerPoint and the previous one to help you. In the exam, you would ideally take 25 minutes to complete the 5 questions. However, obviously we're not in a normal situation. And so at home, whilst we encourage you to try and time yourself about 30 minutes, we understand you may wish to take a little bit longer. Saying that though, I would advise that you take no longer than 45 minutes completing it. Any longer than that, and it's really not realistic of the timings that you would have in the exam. And obviously the more practice you can get under timed conditions, the better. So this is the exam practice questions you are going to have. I'm going to pop it on Show My Homework as both a Word document and a PDF so you can open it. Some of you may wish to print it and then add it to your books, but that's not a requirement. And it's also not a requirement to write the question out, but you can if you wish. If you're doing it in time conditions, which you really should be, obviously you would never be asked to write the question out, as that's wasting time. Just do what I've done on this PowerPoint and the previous one, and that's just put the number of the question in the margin. Because if you do decide to go with a 12 marker first, then I need to know that that's what you're starting with. So make sure you put a 5 in the margin if that's your choice. Advice then. So try and time yourself 30 minutes, 45 minutes max. Remember to use the techniques that I've talked about and that we have practiced previously in lessons. Don't panic. You can do this. You're more than capable of doing this. And actually, the work that some of you have been producing shows that this will be very, very easy for you guys because you've worked really, really hard. Use line paper if you can with a margin, because then obviously you can put the number of the question in the margin. The best thing to do would be to use your book if you have it. Try your best. This isn't going to be perfect. We wouldn't expect it to be perfect even if we weren't in lockdown. You know, this is only your 3rd attempt at a GCSE set of questions, and you're already improving from when we did a first one, so you're doing really well. Finally, what I didn't put on there is it's best not to type, because typing doesn't show you accurately how much you've written, and typing tends to lead us to overwriting because it's easier. So the best thing to do would be to handwrite it if this is really not possible and you're struggling. And also, actually, if you are allowed a computer in the exam, obviously, then you can use a computer. Finally then, I know this has been a really, really long PowerPoint, and well done to those of you who've stuck it out to this point. When you have completed it, do not send it to your teacher just yet. Do not send it, because in a couple of days I'm going to be uploading some model answers to help you improve your work. And what you're going to use, is you're going to read over the model answers that I've come up with, and then using a purple pen you're going to add things to your work that you think would have improved it, and you're going to be giving yourself even better if and a what went well in purple pen. So I'll see your assessment, your exam questions, answers written out in blue or black ink, and then we'll have the purple pen over it, and that is then when you will submit it to a teacher. And they will then save all that work, because that needs to go on to your teacher next year as evidence of work that you've completed, so we can continue to assess you properly and predict your grades properly. And as always, if you have any questions or queries, please do not hesitate to get in touch with your RE teacher. So my email and then Mrs. Griffith's email there as well. Finally, I promise, really big well done. And we're so proud of you and what you've been doing at home. And it's just fantastic. So many of you have stayed engaged with the work, and some of you have gone above and beyond, and it's really amazing to see. So well done. Good luck, don't panic, and I look forward to reading some of your answers.